So let me say at the beginning that, that unlike my previous science courses where I show a lot of slides and really work through the slides, and this time I'm going to be just talking to you a lot. So the point of this course is to really look at the lives of several scientists. And I picked four who play an interacting role in our discovery of what is the gene? What is the gene really? And how does it work? And this is at very much at the core of modern molecular biology. I think the interest in this is first of all, it shows you how science really gets done and the degree to which personal characteristics and personal interactions are involved. But beyond that, there are just four really interesting people, very different lives. And I hope you'll just enjoy the stories of the people themselves. Okay, so let me also say that I'm open to questions. And so if you really have a driving question, you can unmute yourself and ask me. And I will also take a few breaks during the talk to allow for questions so we can discuss this a little bit. Okay, so let me get started here. So I will go to my screen. I'll share it. And there we are. So here is the hero of our story today, who is Gregor Mendel. And it's one of the more amazing and different stories in science is to just how one of the really great discoveries in all of science, basically what's the core of understanding inheritance, was done in such an unusual way by a person so in many ways detached from the science world. All right, so let me go back here and just tell you about this. So, and let me just for the purposes of the recording here, I'm going to close that. I'm going to just set this up so that it will be in this view. All right, let's see if I can, yeah. Okay. Okay, so Gregor Mendel was born in 1822, and he was born on a farm in a little hamlet called Heisendorf. And where this was in the German-speaking part of Moravia. Today, this is in the Czech Republic. Now, it's really important to know for his story that when Gregor Mendel was born, the country he was in was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And in the capital of that empire was in Vienna. It was very close to him, maybe only 100 miles away. And so the culture in which he grew up was this large imperial culture of Austro-Hungary. So his father was a farmer. The farm had been in the family for about 135 years. And his father is described as a hardworking person, a bit gloomy apparently, but had, being a farmer, some botanical interest, especially like grafting fruit trees. And that was probably a part of Mendel's early interest in plant biology. His mother was considered the better nature of the two, but both of them were very good parents to Mendel. He had two sisters. The older sister really had a large role in his life, and he remained very much in touch with his sisters for his whole life. So in his very early schooling, he was apparently recognized as a pretty bright student because although he was a farmer's son, he was sent off to boarding school at the gymnasium. And in this German system, this is a school that's generally a preparation for college. This is pretty early, when he was 1830. All right. And he went to the town of Troppau, which now in the Czech Republic is called Opava. So he lived away from home. Now, one odd thing in his life is that in the last year, the report is that he came home from school, went to bed, and stayed in bed for 4 months. Now the author of this biography, and you'll see this is a recurring thing that happens in Mendel's life, never really has an explanation for it. One wonders, was this depression? Was Mendel in some way bipolar? It doesn't really come out so much later in his life, but we don't really understand why this happened. However, his family and especially his older sister kind of nursed him, encouraged him, and he returned to school and he graduated. So when he finished the equivalent of sort of high school, although the gymnasium is kind of like an advanced high school, in 1840, he was 18 years old. And so he went to college, which was rather unusual for a farmer's son. He went to the Philosophical Institute, which was in the town of Olmütz. This is the German name for that town at the time. However, it was a town in which most of the languages spoken were in Czech. And he struggled with that in some ways. He also had money problems. I mean, they did not have a lot of money to be sending him off to college. And so in 1841, it's reported that he came back and he went to bed and he stayed there for a year. That's what it says. It says he stayed in bed for a year. I don't know what this really meant or what was going on. Anyway, the older sister helped him. She had gotten her dowry money for a future marriage, and she basically postponed looking for a husband to give Mendel the dowry money to allow him to continue on in school. So he recovered. He went back to the institute. He did well. He was a good student and he graduated. So now what to do? He's got a college education. He wanted to continue his education, but he's the son of a poor farmer. And so one of his professors at the college, his physics teacher, had some advice. He said, Mendel, in your situation, there's only one route by which you can continue in any kind of intellectual advice. He said, you have to do what I did. So Franz was the physics professor, had earlier in his life spent 20 years at the Monastery of St. Thomas. And he said, I can get you in. So he wrote to the monks, wrote to the abbot, and he recommended Mendel. And he said, quote, he was a young man of solid character. And he said he was, quote, almost the best, slight praise, but praise of his physics students. Now, the monastery had a series of recent deaths, and they were in fact eager to get a new bright novice. And so they readily accepted Mendel. And as we will see, it was actually a happy outcome for all concerned. Mendel was happy, the monks were happy, it worked out well. So this was 1843, Mendel was 21 years old, and off he went to the monastery. So what was the monastery like? What was the wider world like in sort of 1853? And here we have to kind of set aside our kind of classic view of monks, cloistered monks in the medieval world. It wasn't really like that at all. It was not the medieval world, because 1843, in some ways, the modern age was really beginning. At this point, we had had steam power for decades. The first trains started around 1830, and so there were lots of trains that were already running. There was spreading literacy, and really the Enlightenment had been going for a while. It's been said that the great invention of the Enlightenment was the idea of ignorance, that there were things we didn't know. In 1600, somebody knew the answer to everything. Mostly you could just look it up because Aristotle knew the answer to everything. But the Enlightenment decided, hey, there are a lot of things we just don't understand, and it's legitimate to go looking for answers. So this was the era that Mendel was living in. All right. So he went off to St. Thomas's Monastery. This was an old monastery, had been founded in 1322. The monks were in the Augustinian order, and they were primarily teachers, and they had a real focus on scholarship and research. And the whole Austro-Hungarian Empire was quite interested in the kind of new science ideas that were coming about. So the monastery was located I don't know exactly, probably somewhere between 50 and 100 miles from where he grew up. It was located in the town of Brunn, Brunnn, is how it was pronounced at the time. Today, it is the town of Brno, Brno, and in the Czech Republic. It's pronounced like Brno, but with a rolled R, which I can't do, Brno. And it was a big city. It was the provincial capital of Moravia. It had about 70,000 people at the time. And today in the Czech Republic, this is the second biggest city only after Prague. So he's going to this monastery, an order of monks interested in an intellectual life, and it's in an active big city. So the abbot of the monastery was a guy named Cyril Knapp. He was a very progressive person. He was very interested in science, and his monastery was in the city, and he was very active. He was one of the participants in city life. Among other things, he was the president of the Brno Pomological Society. This is where, growing fruit trees. So he encouraged research projects by his monks, and he supported Mendel very strongly. At one point, a few years later, he gave him some garden space. He even built a greenhouse for him eventually using monastery funds. So it was an excellent environment for Mendel. So for the first 4 years, he came in at the age of 21. He was in the seminary, basically. He was doing religious studies. He was preparing for the priesthood. And in 1847, he turned 25. That was the minimum age for a priest. They really needed priests, so he was ordained. He spent another year sort of completing his theological studies, and then they needed him to go out and take care of one of the parishes. So he was assigned as a parish priest, and he had his priestly duties, and he was administering to the sick, etc., and visiting people. He did that for about a year, and then what did he do? He came back to the monastery and he went to bed for a month, they said. So this recurring theme in Mendel's life just happened again. So the abbot Knapp said, what am I going to do with Mendel? So he wrote to the bishop, and we have a copy of that letter. And he said, Mendel's a very diligent person in the study of the sciences, but he's much less fitted for work as a parish priest. The reason being that he's seized by an uncontrollable timidity when he has to visit a sick person or see anyone ill. All right. So the abbot decided that what Mendel should focus on was teaching. That was one of the roles of the monks in this order. And so he had Mendel teach math at the local high school, basically, the gymnasium. It was in a town called Znain. I don't know how to pronounce that in Czech. But Mendel loved it, and he was good at it. All right. So after doing it just for a year or two, this being the Austro-Hungarian Empire and things were very much regulated, he had to get a teaching certificate. He could be a temporary teacher, but he had to get a certificate. So in 1850, he took an exam for the ability to teach legally at the gymnasium. It involved going before a panel of 6 university professors, and he failed it. He failed it miserably. And it appears that a part of it was that, he was going to be teaching biology and physics. And this was in the early days of the great days of classification, and they had all the taxonomic orders that you were to learn. And he just referred to the animals as cows and pigs and rabbits, etc. So he didn't use taxonomic names. He also apparently had severe exam anxiety, especially in the oral part. But bottom line, he failed the exam. So what to do? Now, what I want to do here is just take a slight break just to show you some pictures to illustrate Mendel's early life here. All right, so here's Gregor Mendel. And let me put this here. So where he grew up was in this province of Moravia. I have not been able to locate exactly where this little hamlet was. His farm was near a town that only had 150 people in it. But the place he spent most of his life is right here. And as I said, right now, this is all part of the Czech Republic. You can see that Vienna is nearby. So I think there's a train that connected the two. And Vienna is going to come to play an important part in our story here. So today, if you go to this area, the Czech Republic has, as a historical site, this was the place where Mendel was born. This was the farm. So you can see it wasn't a little exactly a thatched hut. And I think this is the farmhouse, and this is one of the animal buildings. And of
Barry,
course,
do they still have the bed there that he slept in?
I think he wore it out. And of course, this is a modern picture. So what it looked like, this is 200 years ago. What the farm was like then was probably rather different. Okay. So when he went to the monastery looks pretty much the same as it did in Mendel's time. So the church is back here. You can just see the tower is quite a large abbey church. And the monks lived in this area here. And this that we see outlined here, this is where Mendel's greenhouse was. He also, for a while, had a little garden over here. Of course, this is a very important site now in the Czech Republic, and so you can go and visit this site. So I mentioned that after, Mendel failed his exam, and the abbot decided to make him a teacher. The question, though, was, what are we going to do about getting him his certificate? And the exam had showed he really needed a more formal education. So the abbot decided, we are going to send you to the university for 2 years to get some real training. And so this is the University of Vienna, and that's Mendel right there. You see most of these guys have on these bow ties, but he has his priestly collar on here. There's another one there. Not a very good resolution picture, but this was 1847. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go back to my story here. Okay. So off he went to the university. And this worked out very well for Mendel. All right. He went and looked to see if he could live at the local monastery while he was going to the university, and they said they had no room for him. So lucky Mendel, he ended up basically living like a student for 2 years, which he enjoyed very much. He arrived a little bit late, and so he had to take an extra course load to keep up. He was taking 32 hours a week of lectures and labs. And what was also unusual for him is that even though he was just coming in as a new student, he got a position as an assistant demonstrator for his physics class. And what he was demonstrating was the kind of experiments, et cetera, that the physics students were showing. And his professor was a professor named Doppler. Anybody ever hear of Doppler and the Doppler effect? This is the effect when the train is coming at you, it's going as it goes past. All right, change in the frequency of sound as it's moving. All right. So he was connected with some very good people. Here he was at the university at the center of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So he's going to run into good people. So he did well. One other thing important in his development is this was an era in which there was emphasis on what was called combination theory and computation. So people loved counting things and ordering things like how many chickens and geese and ducks were there in the whole country, and what was the most abundant animal and what was the least abundant animal. And this was something that appealed to Mendel and turned out to be at the heart of the science that he was doing. So his professor was named Franz Unger. That was his botany professor. And the professor worked on hybridization and, among other things, introduced Mendel to the use of pea plants as an experimental organism. His professor was a kind of devotee of a prominent German professor named Schleiden. And for those of you who've taken biology, one of the things you may have had to remember were Schleiden and Schwann. What did Schleiden and Schwann do? Well, they were the founders of the cell theory, the idea that all organisms are made out of cells. So Mendel was really getting exposed to kind of modern science. So at 1853, he's 31 years old. He completed his 2 years. He did well, impressed his professors, some of whom helped him in his later career. And so he returned to teaching and started his program of research. So in 1856, he went back, attempting the second exam, having really received a good education, failed miserably. He just could not do those oral exams. He said he stumbled on the first question. There are various stories about what went wrong. Part of it may have been this exam anxiety, but he just gave up. The story among the monks, who were very much supporters of Mendel, said that he got into a conflict with one of the examiners. This was a board of professors asking him questions, and one was a Professor Fenzel, who was what was called a spermist, that if you looked at plants, they have eggs in the ovary of the plant, and they have pollen, which is the effective equivalent of sperm in animals. And spermists believed that all inheritance was determined by the pollen, that it was the male plant that had the complete full embryo in the pollen grain, and it just passed it on to the female plant for a proper environment in which to develop. And Mendel disagreed with this. They apparently got into an argument, and the exam just went downhill after that. Okay, so back he went to the monastery. So where did he go? Ron, where did he go? To bed, that's right. All right. But after this,
if he could have taken his tests in a bed, he might have done better.
that's right. That's right. Okay. So this really then started Mendel's main career. What was he going to do for a living? He was going to be a teacher. He you know, he's just struggling to get the certificate, but he was able to be a temporary teacher without the proper certificate, and he did it for most of the rest of his life. And he was able to do his research project that he'd gotten very interested in. And his major focus was on the study of hybrids. This was a big deal among plant biologists at the time in botany. So Mendel did 7 or 8 years worth of experiments, and he was really very intellectually involved in it. We know that in 1860, Darwin's Origin of Species book came out. Mendel had a copy. That they have it in the monastery, and it has many of Mendel's notations. He'd gone through Origin of Species very carefully. At one point in 1862, the monastery sent him to the London International Exposition, which was kind of to see what was going on in the modern world. So he was very involved and really had the time to focus on his own research program, which was going to be this study of mutations. So let me turn now to showing you just what did Mendel do and why was his work so important. All right. So here's going to be the science part of this talk. Okay. So here's the group. And I just want to change that there. Okay. So these are all the guys back at the monastery, and this is Mendel here. And what's so interesting about this picture is most of them are posing in a normal way, but Mendel is holding this flower. It's not actually a pea plant, it's a fuchsia, which is his favorite flower. So he had this reputation in this monastery of being obsessed with the plants because they all knew that he was doing these experiments all the time. All right. So what Mendel did is go back there. Mendel chose 7 different traits for his experiments. All right, I want to, I'm getting this stuff on my screen that I just want to get rid of here. Okay, sorry. Okay, so the 7 traits that he decided to look at were the shape of the seed. He did all of this with pea plants, and he picked peas because it was possible to hand pollinate them and not have to worry about pollen blowing around and the plant being pollinated by a plant other than the one he wanted it to be pollinated by. So in peas, he found that you could look at round versus wrinkled peas. If you cut them open, they could be green or yellow. The flowers could be white or purple. The pea pods could be smooth or wrinkled like this. The pea pods could be yellow or green. And the flowers could either be on the tip of the plant or in the axils. And then he also had tall peas and short peas. And these were really different. These were apparently about 10 inches and these were about 4 feet. He spent 2 full years making sure that these characteristics were true breeding, meaning that if you crossed a green pod that was smooth with another green pod that was smooth, that 100% of them came out green and smooth. He wanted true reproductive lines that would give the same trait, inherit the same trait all the time. So once he'd established these as the 6 characters he was going to look at, then he started his experiments. So here was the first key experiment. Whoops. So he took a plant that had green pods, true breeding green pods, and took one that had yellow pods, and he crossed them. He mated them and looked at the progeny. And when he looked at the first generation, which we call the F1, generation number 1, 100% of them were green. Now, this in itself is an important observation. And the reason is that you have to understand that at the time here, this is, 1850s, people really had no good idea of how characteristics were inherited. And the dominant explanation was a blending inheritance. So you think of people raising horses or cows. That was always in the bloodline. So somehow there was some mysterious liquid or essence, something in the blood. And when you put the mother and father together and they produced their babies, that the babies would all be a blended mixture of the 2 parents. Now, this simple experiment shows that that's not true. The yellow and green didn't blend. It all came out looking like one of the parents. All right, then he took this F1 generation and he crossed them with each other. So he took pollen from one F1 and put it in the flower of another F1. So here's this experiment. They both look green. And then he looked at their progeny. And what he found is that the yellow reappeared. Now, of course, people would see this. They would have a red-haired child and neither of the parents had red hair, but say, oh yes, but grandma Mary, she had red hair. So this was a throwback. What Mendel did that was the key, and which people had not really done before, was he counted. He counted exactly how many of these throwbacks there were. And this is some of Mendel's actual data for one of his experiments. In one case, he found that 5,474 looked like the original parent, but 1,852 looked like a gene that had been seen in a previous generation had reappeared. And he noted that this was almost exactly 75%. He did this with all 7 of his traits, flower color, height, etc., and found that in every case, the same thing happened. In the F1, one of the traits dominated, the other was not seen. But then in this next generation, the unseen trait reappeared, but always in this ratio of 3 for the dominant trait and 1 for the recessive trait. So he came up with this terms that in this case, green is a dominant characteristic and yellow is recessive in that it recedes, does not appear if it is the product of a cross with a true breeding dominant line. So the other conclusion, the really important one that Mendel made, was that the information for yellow and green, these packets were present in the F1 plants. There was information for yellow in these plants, but apparently this one had information for yellow and green. This one had information for yellow and green. But when it made a pollen grain, it could only put in the yellow information or the green information, but not both. So if we look at this in modern terms here, and we're going to use Mendel's own terminology that he developed, we could say that, all right, the F1 was a green pod, but it apparently contained 2 packets of information, one which specified green, the dominant characteristic, and the other, which he wrote in a lowercase letter, capital G versus little g. If you got the little gene, that specified yellow. So this green looking plant could produce a pollen grain that had either the big G or the little g, a 50-50 chance. And you could use that to fertilize another F1 plant, and it also could produce an egg that only had the big G or the little g. And they could go together in these 4 combinations. Big G, little g could get together, be big, or a big G and a little g could get together this way, in this way, or 2 little g's could get together. And what you would see is 3 of these would be green because they had the dominant big G package of information. And only 1 of them would be yellow because it inherited this recessive packet of information from each of the 2 parents. So what Mendel really worked out was 2 important things here. One is that information seems to be important in little discrete packets of information, and that they can be inherited in a very predictable way. So important terminology here is that we say that the phenotype of these plants is either green or yellow. So 3 of these have the green phenotype. Phenotype is what we see. But the genotype of these plants actually exist in 3 different possibilities. They could be true breeding dominant ones, or they could be true breeding recessive ones, or they could be like the F1s, what we call heterozygotes. That is, they've got the dominant gene and the recessive gene, but because the dominant gene is dominant, they look like the double one here. All right, so anyway, this was this was kind of the core of Mendel's discovery, but he really went on to do many complicated crosses. I'm just going to show you one more. All right. So he asked, all right, for all 7 of these traits, if I just look at them one at a time, pod color or flower color, I get the same results. I always get this 3-to-1 ratio. But if I got 2 different traits, do they stick together as they were in the parents, or do they operate like separate little packets of information? So he did this experiment. He took a plant that was a true breeding green pod plant, true breeding purple flower plant. And he crossed it with one that had a true breeding yellow pods, true breeding white flowers. And when he crossed them, he got the same result that we saw before, was that green was dominant. Every plant was dominant because you knew everything inherited the dominant green gene. That's the only kind of pollen and eggs this could make. And every plant had purple flowers because everyone inherited a dominant gene from the parent. So 100% were green pod, purple flower. So we say the phenotype is green and purple. But Mendel knew from his single experiments that all of these F1 progeny carry the recessive yellow and white genes. So what happens now if he crosses them with each other? All right. And so this is a 2-factor cross. And what he found is that the genes for 2 different traits are inherited independently. In other words, if the parent was green and purple, would the progeny also be green and purple? No. There was a high likelihood that they would be green and white. But he got this interesting ratio. It was this 9-3-3-1 ratio. 9 of them, most of them were green and purple. Now, it's not surprising that was most abundant because these are the ones that have the dominant gene. But 3 of them were green dominant, white recessive, and what they look like. 3 were yellow recessive, purple dominant, and what they look like. And only 1 out of the 16 showed both of the recessive traits, yellow and white. And if you work through this, and those of you who've taken biology probably remember doing this, we call these Punnett Squares. It's named after a biologist from about 1920, Mr. Punnett, Dr. Punnett, who invented this simple diagrammatic way of showing what happens. So if you have 2 different genes, each of which has 2 alternative forms, pod color, it can be green or yellow, flower color can be purple or white, then you have 4 possible types of sperm or eggs. They can have the 2 dominants or just dominant green, recessive purple, recessive green, dominant purple, or the 2 recessives, yellow and white. All right. And if these are 4 equally possible types of pollen grains you can get, and the female can make 4 equally possible types of eggs, then they go together in these 16 possible combinations, all equally likely. And if you look at them here, how many of these squares have at least 1 big G and at least 1 big P? And the answer is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, I miscounted. 1, 2, 3, 4. No, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, and then 8. Okay, and 9. Right, 8 and 9. Right. So we're looking for 9, 3, 3, 1. How many have a big G but no big P? One here, and one here. 3. How many have a big P, but no big G? And the answer is one here, and one here. How many have only the recessive 1? And so you get 9331 by this very simple probability estimate. If each of the combinations are equally likely and they get together an equally likely chance, you'll get a 9331 ratio. So Mendel went on to do 3-factor crosses. He did a lot of experiments, and it was consistent with this behavior that I've shown you here. So what did he conclude? And today we call these Mendel's laws. I'm not going to give you the terminology we use because it's confusing, but there are really 2 main points. Is for any single trait, like pod color, every plant has information that it got from the mother and from the father, but only one form of the information, so for pod color, either the green or the yellow, is put into an egg or into a pollen grain. So the second thing is that if you're observing 2 different genes, like pod color, which has 2 alternate forms, or flower color, which has 2 alternate forms, the information for the 2 traits assort independently. They don't behave as though they're linked together. And so what we know is that the information does not blend. It is in some discrete packet, which we now know is a DNA molecule. These are genes, and genes are regions of DNA. And that these genes are inherited by simple predictions from probability. So that was Mendel's great contribution. Now, I should add at this point, the kind of important, some people will say, well, Mendel wasn't really right, just as some people say Newton wasn't really right. Well, Mendel was right in the core. Situation was more complicated than what he found, but his laws are still at the core of our understanding of genetics. The important modifications that you can think of is that it's interesting that all 7 of Mendel's characteristics showed this dominance and recessive relationship. But there are a lot of genes that don't do that. So there are a number of flower color genes. You can look at petunias. This is not a petunia, it's a diagrammatic flower. But if you have a true breeding red form and a true breeding white form, and you cross them, there's no dominance. Everything inherited, one red and one white, and what you get are flowers that are pink. All right. Now, if you do the F1s here, the white ones will reappear in that next generation. But this is a kind of mix of, sometimes it's called codominance. So this dominance recessive relationship is not always the case. And there are a lot of examples of this. The second thing is that Mendel showed with all 7 of his traits that they never stuck together. Pod color and flower color just behaved completely independently. But it was soon found that there were lots of exceptions to that some genes are linked together and they are inherited together. So for example, we know that people who have an inherited form of color blindness are typically men. So the genes that characterize male versus female also characterize some forms of color blindness. Now, we know why that is today. It's because genes are on chromosomes, and chromosomes are one long piece of DNA. And so you can have genes close together on the same DNA molecule, and they will be inherited together. So I should mention at this point, it's long been a question of why didn't Mendel find that? Why did all of Mendel's 7 characters appear to be unlinked? And it's kind of against the laws of probability. It's probably because he spent 2 years kind of doing his preliminary experiments, and he probably picked out the ones that were following the rules that he thought he was saying. There's apparently quite an academic literature on the question of, did Mendel cheat? The idea that you would accuse this Augustinian monk of cheating on his numbers. All right. But there's no real evidence that he did cheat. His numbers are awfully good for this 3-to-1 ratio. We don't really know if he fudged his data a little bit. If so, it almost supports his genius, because he really had come to a conclusion and he really had a clear view of what was going on here. And maybe he nudged the numbers a little bit just to make sure that they showed that. The last important modification to Mendel's laws is that many characteristics are polygenic. That is, they're not inherited or determined just by one simple gene. And a good example is hair color in humans. So we have at least 4 different genes. Do you make the black pigment or not? Do you make a red pigment or not? Is the intensity of your pigment high or low? And so all of those combinations give you black hair, brown hair, blonde hair, red hair, etc. And so if you pick that as a trait, what you would find is just not a true breeding characteristics. And so those are difficult. Okay, so what I'm going to do now, let me stop sharing for a bit here and just open this up a bit to questions. There's more of Mendel's story because we want to know, all right, he found all of this important information. What happened next? But any questions at this point?
Barry, this is Ray. I have a question. How long did it take to grow a crop of peas? I mean, it seems like it would take a long time to get another mature pea and then breed that and then get another generation. How long was each generation taking?
I think he basically only got 2 crops a year. So he was at this for 8 years. So he really got to do about 16 crosses. It was quite a big effort, and he had a little greenhouse that the Abbot gave him just for his project. But yeah, and he really had to plan ahead to do it. Yeah. Other questions? Okay. All right. Okay. Well, then we'll move on. All right. So I should also say that Mendel didn't use the word gene, and it's not clear, really if he really had the concept in the same way that we did. It's hard for us to put ourselves in that intellectual environment to see how little you had to work with when you were struggling, even with the idea of organisms being basically made out of molecules and chemicals. He used a German word called Merkmal, M-E-R-K-M-A-L. It's often translated as some quantity you can see and recognize. And he used the word elements, but both characterize some distinctive kind of package trait, which we now know of as a gene. So in 1865, so just as the Civil War was coming to an end in the United States, he made 2 presentations to the Bruins Society for the Study of Natural Sciences. And this was a very decent kind of local scientific research group. Apparently about 40 attended, and he gave his talk, which was pretty good. Let me grab the book here. I just want to read you one little section from the report on his talk. Okay. Here we go. So it was written up in the local newspaper. They had a daily newspaper. And so the reporter there produced a respectable summary of Mendel's paper. He described the audience reaction is not bored. They said, quote, the numerical data with regard to the occurrence of differentiating characters in the hybrids and the relation to the stem species were worthy of consideration. Quote, the theme of the lecture was well chosen, the exposition of it entirely satisfactory, and this was shown by the lively participation of the audience. All right, so he reported his results, got a pretty good reception. This was a serious scientific society that in fact published the presentations. So he wrote this up very carefully in a pretty long paper. And the proceedings from the societies were published in 1866. So Mendel ordered 40 copies, which was unusual in the time. These things were expensive. The monastery apparently had a little bit of money. And he sent them out to scientists throughout Europe and England. He had been at the University of Vienna. He had some tenuous connections. We know of at least where 12 of the copies went to. And interestingly, years later, when they were looking through Darwin's collection, they found a copy of Mendel's paper. But in those days, it was typical when you published such a thing that was printed and then folded and obviously had to be cut open before it could be read. Darwin's copy had never been cut open. He'd received it, but he never read it, which is one of the great ironies in science history, because had he read it, he would have had the molecular basis for his theory of speciation, which gave him much trouble in the later parts of Darwin's life. One reprint went to some Dutch biologist who then passed it on to a very eminent plant biologist named Hugo de Vries, who turns out to have an important part of our story. But basically, he waited to hear whether the scientist thought good or badly of his paper, and he got almost no response, nothing, except one very eminent scientist. This was a Professor Nageli. Nageli had been the mentor of Darwin's professor at the University of Vienna. Darwin's professor was Unger, and Unger was a student of Nageli. So he was an eminent biologist, Nageli was, and he had read Mendel's paper, read it carefully, and wrote him a very careful letter, which we still have a copy of. So it basically expressed skepticism about Mendel's results. He was just skeptical about the numbers. And what he said about these F1 hybrids and whether they contain these recessive genes or not, quote, I expect that when they were inbred, they would, in other words, if you kept breeding, they would sooner or later be found to vary a lot once again. So what the problem was that Mendel's results really challenged Nageli's ideas, and his reputation was built on his ideas. He did not want to hear what Mendel was saying, and he either didn't understand it or he just didn't want to believe it. If we look in the literature, there were a few quotations of Mendel's out there, most of which seemed to just vanish into the vapor. The most important was that in 1881, so this is, this is 15 years after he gave the talk, there was an academic book that was widely read on plant experimentation. And that book had 15 citations of Mendel's work. It was also cited, interestingly, one year in 1881 in the Encyclopedia Britannica. But otherwise, it was just not known. No one said anything to Mendel after Nageli's letter. And so what happened to poor Mendel? Well, he went the route of a lot of academics. The abbot had died, the monks had a vote, and Mendel became the new abbot of the monastery. Okay, so this was just 1868, just 2 years after publishing his paper. And so the last 16 years of his life, he did some puttering in the garden, but mostly he was just involved in administration. He worked with some other organisms. Nagelli, the guy who wrote him the long letter, recommended that he switch from peas to hawkweed, which turns out to be a terrible experimental system for this type of work. It's hard to keep the pollen from spreading from one plant to the other, and it has some weird genetics. He was an avid beekeeper, Mendel was. There's one interesting story that at one point he decided to do animal work and was starting to breed mice in his bedroom. And this was earlier on, and the local bishop in a tour of the monastery thought that it was highly inappropriate for a celibate monk to be putting these male and female mice together to produce his second generations of mice, and they put the kibosh on the mouse experiments. So he was apparently a popular abbot and good. He was a popular person among the monks. It was kind of sad at the end is that in 1874, the city, the big city, decided that they needed to put a tax on the monasteries. Mendel was the abbot. He was firmly opposed to this tax. He got into a long-running political battle with the civic authorities, and he became somewhat isolated and embittered by this political problem that he had. He contracted Bright's disease, which is a kidney disease, and in 1884, he died of kidney failure, really not knowing whether his work would ever mean anything to the wider world. So what happened then? Let me just show you a couple of pictures once again here. Okay. So here's his paper. It's in German, so it was published in the city of Brunn in 1865 and by Gregor Mendel, single author paper. He did all the work himself. And just yesterday I was saying I think maybe when I was a graduate student years ago, I looked at this paper. I looked again yesterday, and it's a really well-written, really clear paper, and the logic is laid out beautifully. It was not that difficult to understand. The thing is, it's a long paper. It's got a lot of numbers in it, and you can just see people just said, I'm just not going to wade through this math. So here he is as abbot, and as I said, basically successful until he got into this political battle over the money in his later years. But then in the year 1900, Mendel's work was rediscovered. And these three people were much involved. Now they're all shown here later in life. When they found it, they were all actually younger men than are shown in these pictures. This guy, in fact, was involved least, was 26 years old as a graduate student when he first cited Mendel's paper in one of his own graduate student publications. The person who really rescued Mendel's reputation was William Bateson. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that story right now. So let me go back here. Stop sharing. Okay. So in 1900, three people all found his paper, apparently within a few months of each other, or at least published it and promoted it. So the two most important, one was a prominent Dutch botanist named Hugo de Vries. He had been studying mutations. He called them monstrosities. So if he had flowers that were a different color or a different shape, a monstrosity, he would cross it with a normal flower and see what the quote hybrids look like. And he was coming up with inheritance ratios of about 3-to-1. Although if you look at his data, it wasn't really that close to 3-to-1. And there's some idea that he had Mendel's paper, and he may have really gotten his ideas from Mendel. And although he didn't cite Mendel in his initial published work, finally, when Mendel's paper started to be seen by a second scientist, I'm going to mention in a minute, that De Vries in 1900 published a paper in which he quoted Mendel as getting results similar to his De Vries, although he specifically said in the paper that he had learned of the existence of Mendel's paper after he had made the discovery by himself, maybe. The other key player was a guy named Karl Corrins. He was a German in Tübingen. And interestingly, he was a student of Nageli, the guy who wrote Mendel the long letter, skeptical letter. So we know that Corrins' advisor had Mendel's paper. Corrins had Mendel's paper. Corrins was doing similar experiments. He came up with results very much like Mendel's. Corrins and De Vries were competing, and Corrins was very angry that De Vries kept beating him out, publishing results similar to what Corrins was seeing, but De Vries was getting that first. And he felt that De Vries really had seen Mendel's paper, and that's where he got his ideas. Felt that De Vries didn't really understood what the 3-to-1 ratio meant, how to interpret it. So Corrins published his own paper, and the title of the paper is Gregor Mendel's Law Concerning the Behavior of Progeny of Varietal Hybrids. And in that paper, he accuses De Vries of stealing Mendel's work. All right. So it got into a little scientific fight there. The third person, this Erich von Teschemack, he was a graduate student. He had found Mendel's paper. The consensus among the academics who study this history is that he didn't really understood what Mendel had done, but he realized it was an important issue at the time, and he wanted part of the fame of being a rediscoverer. So he just attached the Mendel citation to one of his own papers. But beyond these three, the other person who came involved very quickly was in England at Cambridge, and this was William Bateson. He was a very eminent scientist of the day. He was a member of the Royal Society. He was one of the big defenders of Darwin. And the story was that somebody sent him Mendel's paper after this rediscovery by the Dutch and the Germans came out. And he read it on the train as he was going to give a major address at a scientific meeting. And he thought the paper was brilliant and clear and extremely important. And so it was Bateson who introduced Mendel to the English-speaking world in an address to the Royal Horticultural Society, subsequently published. And it was Bateson who coined the word genetics. The word gene per se really didn't appear until about 9 years later, a Danish guy named Johansen. And what Johansen came up with the word really as a nod to Darwin. Darwin had talked about pangenesis and had this phrase pangen. And so he said, we're going to talk about packets of information as being genes. Okay. So Mendel was recognized. And once these papers were found, because it was so clear and beautiful science, it really just exploded. It just explained things in a way that had not been clear before. So in 1910, there was a statue of Mendel that was made, and it was unveiled in the town square in Brunn. And Bateson came and gave one of the speeches for the unveiling of the statue. I'm going to show you a picture of what this looks like here. So this was Bateson, and this was his paper, Experiments in Plant Hybridization by Gregor Mendel. And he talks about the paper, tells them how important it was. Okay. And so this is the statue. It's an interesting statue, 1910. Here's Mendel. doesn't really look a lot like him. What's interesting is down here at the base of it, this is pretty sexy for a monk, and this thing ended up in this monastery. Here we have these two naked people down here, and the whole point was that this guy had really figured out the basic laws of inheritance that were so important to humans. The statue was originally put in a town square, a fairly important town square in the city of Brunn. However, in 1950, this area of Czechoslovakia was controlled by the Soviets, and the Soviet-controlled Czechoslovakian army came in the middle of the night and moved the statue to some hidden location. And the reason is 1850 was the prime of Lysenkoism in Russia. Lysenko was Stalin's geneticist and believed that if you wanted to make apple trees produce sweet apples, what you did was you put sugar in the soil, they would take that out, become sweet, and then those apples would pass it on to their progeny. It was completely bogus. Stalin completely bought it. All of Mendelian genetics was verboten in Russia, although I don't know what the Russian word for verboten is, forbidden. And so this statue of Mendel had to be taken away from Russian-controlled territory. In '64, when Khrushchev fell from power, the Czechs came, got the statue in its hidden location, and they moved it to the monastery courtyard. And so today you can go to the monastery and you can see Mendel's space, and you can see this statue. And there's a very good museum there showing the various old photographs and such that they have, and Mendel's manuscripts, etc. So in the end, there's no doubt that Mendel's work was recognized. We talk about, for example, Newtonian physics, and we talk about Mendelian genetics. There's kind of no higher order than to have an entire field of science named after you. Shame he didn't get a little of the credit in his lifetime, but still he did work, and he did good work, and is apparently a nice guy and a good priest, and he's produced some science that's become the core of many ways of modern molecular biology. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. Any questions in the science or Mendel or other parts of the history? Okay, let me, and you can unmute yourself if you have a question. So Ron?
A question and a comment. One is, did you read his paper in the original German?
No.
Oh, I was so impressed there for a moment. I'm still impressed, but
No.
good
No.
presentation, certainly.
No.
Then my comment is, it seems that he challenged the hypothesis that one's creative talents are best when in the shower. Apparently they're really good, but not only is it apparent, but we could test it further, since those who understand that go to bed with a notepad and pencil on one's night table. So there is some truth to that, maybe.
Okay. All right. Harriet.
A couple questions. With this new development of epigenetics, are people calling that Lysenkin at all?
Well,
Based on Lysenko, has that been revived? And the other question is, oh, I'm sorry.
Well, no, I see your point. In a way, it because the epigenetics is really a form of inheritance of an acquired characteristic. I think one of the important distinctions is epigenetic changes do not persist. And so, this is changes not to the DNA itself, but to the proteins that control whether the DNA can be read or not. And basically, we find things like the mothers who are starving while they are pregnant will often turn off certain genes involved in metabolism, and those genes will be turned off in the fetus and in the child. And so it may persist. A characteristic in the mother will be passed on to the progeny, but that progeny is unlikely to pass it on to the next generation. So it's real, but it's not quite long-term inheritance. Yeah.
The other question, it was just very quickly, we've been reading so much in the last decades about research done with fruit flies, which have a shorter turnover.
Mhm.
And is that all based on Mendel's laws?
They were, in fact, probably the most important organism to really build upon Mendel. So starting as early as 1910 or so, that's where the idea that genes were linked and genes were on chromosome, that was really discovered in fruit flies. So, virtually everything follows Mendelian genetics. There are kind of some weird microbial things where you don't really have a true mother and father that don't. But yes, absolutely. It's one of the beauties of it, is that it can explain inheritance in virtually all organisms. Roger, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just had a historical question and maybe a comment too. The question is, when Mendel's work was beginning to be appreciated around 1900, did those people make a connection with molecular science that this was contained in molecules? Because I know molecular science was just new at that time. And I'm just curious if they were beginning to make that connection, although I know the DNA came very much later.
1900, no. In fact, they still really didn't know the role of chromosomes then. And the connection with genes and chromosomes is maybe 10 years later, 1910, 1920. And then, of course, for a long time, it was felt that genes, when they started thinking of molecules, they felt they had to be proteins. It seemed to be the only thing in the cell with sufficient complexity. And of course, that turned out to be wrong. They found out chromosomes were made of DNA and proteins, and it was quite a struggle actually to convince the scientific world that it was the DNA that was important, and we'll get into that a little bit next time.
Okay. I had a quick comment, if I might.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned Doppler and trains,
Mm-hmm.
and I can't resist mentioning a wonderful experiment that Doppler did. He put a bunch of buglers on a train car, and they drove the train past people, and the buglers could blow a perfect A note, and the people then saw that the note was in fact changing. And this picture of these buglers sitting in their chairs on this train blowing their bugle is to me is a wonderful experiment.
Yeah, good one. Okay. All right. Any other questions? Okay. All right. If not, so what we're going to do next time is we're going to start what's going to be basically a sort of 3-lecture story, because we're going to shift to the more modern world, the idea that DNA is where the genes are. And so if we could find out what the structure of DNA is, we might learn a lot about genes. And there were 3 people involved. And so the way I'm going to organize this is in the next lecture, I'm going to tell you about the early life of these 3 people, which is Francis Crick, Rosalind Franklin, and James Watson. And we'll kind of end the next lecture when they all converge in the same year, 1951, at Cambridge University and in London. And then following that, we'll have all 3 together participating in the story. And then following that, we'll say what happened to them after. What happened to them after. Okay, so all right. If there are no more questions, thanks for your patience. Didn't know how this would work, just being a talking head for all that time, sort of going through all of my data slides. But I'll see you all in a week then. All right, thank you.